Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I am delighted to bring you Bury Me Deep by Harold Q. Masur. And this is copyright 1948 by Simon & Schuster and their Inner Sanctum imprint. You can see their logo there. I'm not crazy about this logo. To me, it looks a little bit like a Martian reading a book. So not one of my favorites. I do think there were better mystery imprint logos out there. Like Mysterious Press has this really cool, almost tavern sign with kind of a Jekyll and Hyde font. That's really cool. I like Minotaur has this sort of almost like pencil sketch of the Minotaur of Greek fame. Probably though the best is if you think about the old Crime Club. I should have had one ready to show you, but if you think of the old Crime Club books, you see the logo is kind of a man, a silhouette of a man pointing a gun. But if you turn it 90 degrees, you see that the man is actually made up of the letters C-R-I-M and E. So that one was really clever. Don and Mead, Red Badge. I mean, what can you do with the red badge? I mean, good title for an imprint, but not an exciting logo. So I've mentioned before on here that the Inner Sanctum imprint was really good. They published a lot of fantastic writers and fantastic books, and they got Richard Masur, or Masur, started on his career. So we have to thank them for that, because I am really a fan of this writer, and I will tell you why. I should just mention two things. I'm not really sure of the pronunciation of his last name. I can't find it anywhere. So I'm going to say Masur, but if anyone knows for sure, please let me know. I'm also very, very curious as to what the Q stands for in his middle initial, and I can't find information about that anywhere either. So if anybody knows, please let me know. It's just one of those niggling questions that I'd love to have an answer to. So before we get into the book and the series, just a little bit about Masur. He was born in New York City, and he served in the military and also was a real-life lawyer. And so not surprisingly, his series character, Scott Jordan, is a lawyer who lives in New York City. And Bury Me Deep is his first published novel. So I was really happy to be able to read this. Great cover here with this sort of femme fatale, kind of Lana Turner-esque woman, kind of in the shape of a keyhole, which is relevant to the plot. And I like this kind of black and white noir cover with just the red lips as a, to pop for some color. So, a great book with a great cover design. So what I will say about the character of Scott Jordan is, I guess in America at least, we kind of have this almost Jungian dislike of lawyers. It's just, it goes back to Shakespeare, right? First kill all the lawyers. Lawyers are probably not anybody's idea of our favorite people. I've known some lovely lawyers, but let's face it, they don't have the best reputation. And so I always think it's tricky to write a book about a lawyer, because I feel like you've kind of got to get over that hump of the reader feeling a little bit not quite ready to fall in with a lawyer whose ethics may be sketchy. But what I'll say here is that the character of Scott Jordan, even though he's a lawyer, he is more hard-boiled and more of a hard-ass and more of a tough guy than any policeman or any private eye or any other tough guy you can think of. He is one tough cookie, OTC. Very, very pugnacious, quick with his fists, mouthy, definitely mouthy, always mouthing off to authority, and just a no-nonsense guy. He does not want to put up with anybody's bull. And that makes him, I don't know, in a way, like almost a character of aspiration, because wouldn't we all love to just be so tough that we can run roughshod over cops and district attorneys and criminals and lowlives? And Scott Jordan is able to do all of that because he's, he's strong and he's very, very smart and he's very good at what he does. I will say I've read several of the later books in the series, and he does mellow out a bit as the series progresses. But in this one, he's a tough guy, so expect that. Not to the point of Mike Hammer, wanting to shoot everyone and everything, but like I said, Scott Jordan is quick with his fists. And at the same time, of course, irresistible to women, right? Because weren't they all back in the golden era of mysteries? Or, even today, to a certain extent. Male writers writing male characters, maybe a little wish fulfillment, that every beautiful woman within a radius of 100 miles will throw themselves at them, and then they can have their pick of the, from the pantheon of Greek and Roman goddesses. So let me tell you a little bit about the story, and then I'll tell you why I like the book and I like the series so much. And then we'll talk about maybe two sort of almost like literary criticism things, or two little side topics, because I always like to talk a little bit more than about just the book itself. So great setup to this story. Scott comes home to New York City from a trip to Florida where he was kind of closing a real estate deal. And he walks into his apartment to find a gorgeous blonde wearing only her bra and panties. And of course, she is all that, right? And nice thing to come home to. But Scott, being suspicious of everyone and everything, isn't like, oh, how wonderful, there's an almost naked lady in my house. He's like, who are you and what are you doing here? But, she tries to cozy up to him. She tries to flirt with him a little bit. And, he's having none of it. And it leads to kind of this and she's a little drunk, tipsy. And, it leads to this very funny turnabout right in the first chapter where, I guess we think of, a typical heterosexual man always trying to get a woman's clothes off. And in the first chapter, what Scott is doing is trying to get her clothes on. So he's forcibly putting her clothes back onto her because he does not want the drama that he knows that she's going to bring into his life. And he wants her out of his apartment too. But before he can do that, there's a knock on his door. And before he can open the door, she sort of throws herself at him, and he's sitting down and she starts kissing him passionately, and he's being made love to when these people walk in, and this cop and a couple of other people, and excuse me, Jordan throws them out, and then he's like, I got to get rid of this woman. So he fills her up with coffee, and then he finds a cab driver who will drive her around New York City and bring her home, when she finally sobers up. But this woman, her name is Verna Ford, she dies in the taxi cab of poisoning. So, of course, Scott, having been the last to see her, is a suspect, and he has to unravel what's going on. As the story progresses, we meet a bunch of his friends and his colleagues, and he has pot shots taken at him, with guns, and people are warning him to get off the case. Meanwhile, a lot of the people involved in this case want to hire him as their attorney, and you get the sense, as Scott does too, that they all have something to hide, and so they want to take advantage of that attorney-client privilege so that he won't be able to, share their evil doings, in court. But Scott is a very, very moral person, and he will not, by any means take money to help a guilty person escape, or help a murderer get away with it, or help a criminal defraud the system. Like he only wants to represent you if he thinks you are a good guy or a good gal. And so he turns down offers left and right. People are throwing money at him. I mean, I wish people threw money at me the way they throw money at Scott Jordan in this book, but he's above it all. He doesn't take anybody's money. But he does have a good relationship, develops a good relationship with the homicide detective, John Nola, Nola, which always makes me think of New Orleans, Louisiana. And they decide to kind of work together to get to the bottom of what's going on. And the plot, I will say, gets a little bit intricate, but not so intricate that you can't follow it. I find this is a characteristic of Masur's books, is his plots are almost like a coil. And by that I mean he's got a cast of characters who seem to be kind of independent of one another. But as the story progresses, you find out that these characters have relationships with each other that you didn't know about, or that the world didn't know about. And I'm not talking about, necessarily sexual relationships. They could have been business partners. They could have been roommates. They could have been married at one point, right? And so uncovering the relationships between these people is really key to uncovering the mystery and what's going on in this book. And I like that because it adds, it keeps the focus on the characters as well as the storytelling. And it also keeps the plot really moving along very swiftly because there's new information given to you in every chapter. Scott's investigations bear fruit. And you're not left with that kind of slump. Some books you have that slump in the middle, and that's never the case in any Masur book that I've ever read. They're always just kind of a race from start to finish. So the suspense is terrific. So that's kind of an overview of the book. I'm going to tell you a bunch of the things that I really like about this book. In addition to this kind of tightly coiled plot, I think that very often a really good book has a secondary character, a supporting character to the protagonist, who almost, but not quite, could take over the book and carry the book on his own. And here, the character of Nola, the homicide cop. Great guy, great cop. He and Jordan work together very well. And I like that too. I like when authorities and private eyes and so forth work together. It's just so much more like it gets the job done so much faster, right? I mean, there's a staple in these books where, the attorneys are going to fight with the district attorney, and, the cops are going to lean on the PIs because they don't want them on their turf or whatever. Just makes more drama for everybody and doesn't necessarily lead to the best outcome. But here, the characters cooperate. I also like the fact that several of the plot points in this book hinge on legal matters. So, the law is a difficult and unwieldy thing, right? But because our narrator is a lawyer, it makes sense to have the plot points be things that have to do with laws and the breaking of laws that would be part of the protagonist's expertise. And I'm not talking about really, laws from, 1800 that, haven't been looked at in, 200 years. I'm talking about things like in this book, at the time the book was written, the only legal justification for divorce in New York, or at least New York City, was infidelity. And I found that interesting, right? I didn't know that there was a time when that was the only acceptable legal reason, for granting a divorce, which led to some fancy footwork. People would go to Reno and establish residency there for a few weeks and then serve papers from the distance. And it was all kind of dicey, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But that kind of plays a part in this book. And other legal aspects play a part in this book too, like what you're allowed to do when you're on parole and what you're not allowed to do on parole. So they're not super complicated things, but they are things that play on the plot. And I liked how Masur writes from such a place of knowledge about these things and works them into the plot in a way that is explained to the reader, that makes a lot of sense, that is not complicated, but that are clues to solving the various mysteries. I also think Masur was a terrific writer. Quite hard-boiled, as I mentioned, very, very tough, great one-liners. Like I said, a little mouthy, but I often find that hard-boiled books are, for me, the funniest, which sounds kind of like an oddity, right? But it just the prose can be so razor sharp and the observations so dead on. You kind of have to laugh. And a lot of these hard-boiled writers were really good comedically, and so I really like that about Masur. In fact, I think he does just about everything well, from character to plot to setting. New York City is very nicely established here. Again, in kind of residential hotels and rooming houses, a world that I find kind of fascinating because I think it's mostly gone, although maybe it's just something that I don't know anything about and still happens in big cities, probably. But I don't have any experience with that. And the mystery is good. This book is truly a mystery in that, sometimes books they're sort of lighthearted novels of suspense, and there's a little mystery to be worked out, or one murder to be solved. In this book, there's a whole slew of crimes and a whole slew of really strange circumstances happening throughout the book. And it takes a clever, really intelligent investigator to figure out what's going on. And that is what Scott Jordan is. He's really got a brilliant legal mind and a brilliant deductive mind. And it's so easy to admire somebody who is so good at their craft. And like I said, every one of Masur's books that I've read fits the description that I'm giving you here. Like I said, I think Jordan mellows a little bit in later books, but that's neither here nor there. So a few funny things about this book, I think, are, I'm amazed when I read these books from the 30s and 40s at how instantaneous love is. That people meet and they are literally in love within 2 minutes of meeting. And so Scott picks himself up a woman, a girlfriend, Dulcie, early in the book, and within 5 minutes there, he's proposing marriage, and it's all this kind of love. But of course, that doesn't stop every other attractive woman in the book from throwing herself at Scott, trying to get him to kiss them, and he's like, no, I'm a one-woman man, and he's very he now that he's found the love that he's looking for, he's not about to go around just having a little fun on the side. And like I said, of course, the women who throw themselves at him are these amazingly gorgeous creatures. Which leads me to kind of one of my like literary criticism things about this book, and that is the femme fatale, right? I mean, there's so much that can be said. I actually think it could be the topic of a PhD dissertation. Maybe it has been. You know, reading this book from a 2025 perspective and seeing the roles that women played in this book, you know, there were good girls and there were bad girls, like Verna Ford, the murdered woman. She was a bad girl. You know, she was greedy and she was from the wrong side of the tracks and she was unethical. Dulcie is a good girl. And then there's various other women in the book who, I don't mean anything offensive by this term, who use their feminine wiles. That is their way of trying to get what they want or to manipulate Scott Jordan. Scott Jordan is not easily manipulated, but that does not stop women from trying. And, you know, I think that, you know, feminist readers or those who are tuned to this thing will say, you know, we've really come kind of far from that binary of the bad girl versus the good girl. But, you know, I worked with a feminist author a number of years ago, really terrific writer and thinker. And I mean, there's no bigger feminist in the world than this woman. And I remember having a conversation with her and her saying, you know, I've kind of done a 180 on this thing. I now think that, you know, I used to think, you know, women should be judged for their intelligence and their accomplishments and what they're capable of doing. And she said, now I think women have the right to use whatever tools they have at their disposal to get ahead in the world. So if that means wearing a tight blouse to an interview and flirting with the interviewer to get a really good job with high pay, she was all for it. Maybe this was a little bit before, you know, the Me Too. But, you know, it does seem like society is swinging back a little bit more to, you know, allowing women their sexuality and their physical presence and allowing it to be a part of who they are as opposed to tamping it down. So it's just like, you read a lot of these early books, and so many of the women do fall into the femme fatale category that it's, like I said, there's a lot that can be said about that. But there are, you know, plenty of writers who pushed against that as well. Like, I want to say, I always come back to her because I love her so much, Margaret Miller. You know, her women were tough and strong, you know, in the 40s and beyond. And, you know, I suspect Margaret Miller was a very strong woman too, based on, you know, biographies that I've read of her. But if you read this book, check out the way womanhood is portrayed and see what you think. You know, was it really just a sign of, you know, not fiction, but the way people really thought in those days? You know, people playing the roles that society wrote for them. You know, playing out those scripts. The other thing I want to talk about is, this may seem a little bit off topic, but you know me, I like to do that once in a while. The price of this book, I just want to tell you, was $2.50. And I thought, wow, that's pretty nice. But that started me thinking, $2.50 in 1948, what would that be today? What's the equivalent in dollars today? So I used everybody's friend AI to work with the Consumer Price Index to find out that the equivalent today is $35.85. So that this book, its price today, would be $35.85, which shows me that books were more expensive back then than they are now. I mean, you can get a gigantic Tom Clancy or Stephen King, and the cover price will be $35. But most mysteries, I think are in the $24.95 to $26.95 range, meaning that, in terms of purchasing power or value of the dollar, hardcover books are a little bit cheaper now than they were, less expensive now than they used to be. And if you think about, these prices back in the 40s as part of a budget, you can understand why maybe they were only available or could only really be purchased by fairly well-heeled people who had decent amounts of disposable income, which is why libraries are such a wonderful invention. I mean, don't get me started on how much I love libraries. I mean, we all do. But, when I was a kid and I had no money, I haunted my town's library and found a lot of great books there that I would never been able to afford on my own. And it also shows the importance of paperbacks the development of the paperback in terms of lowering the price to a place where, maybe a more middle class or a person lower on the socioeconomic scale could afford to buy books. And then, of course, there were also these paid lending libraries, right? I've got books from there where there's there's sort of a sticker inside that says, rent this book 10 cents for 3 days or 25 cents for a week. And it's just, I love the fact that people have, since, I don't want to say since time immemorial, because I don't think this happened in Gutenberg's time, but, in our lifetimes over the last century, people have found creative ways to get books to people who want to read them. There's just sort of a path. If you really want to read a book, you can get to it one way or another. Hopefully not illegally. Hopefully not by pirating an illegal PDF from the web. Bad. Don't do that. But look for a legal path, and you will be able to find the book that you want, I suspect. So that's me, love of books, love of the publishing industry history. I thought I'd also let you know that the rate of inflation between 1948 and 2025, it was 1,335%. So that number was used to calculate the price of this book in $2025. So Harold Q. Masur, a wonderful writer, a terrific series with Scott Jordan. I recommend him highly. I think he's a real find. I sadly put him in the category of forgotten mysteries because I don't hear much about him these days. But if this sounds like something you would like, I really think you are in for a treat, and you may find a new favorite writer. So that's it for tonight. As always, thank you for listening. I see I've gone on way too long as usual, but what the heck. Have a good night. Bye.